Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, perhaps, to some of you where you're dialing in from. Welcome to our webinar for this morning to our CPD community. Delightful to see so many of you joining us this morning. I hope you've had a fabulous weekend, whatever you've been doing, as we count down to the lead up to Christmas. And yeah, here in the UK, where I'm dialing in from, at the moment, on the northwest contingent of our office. It's quite a gloomy day here in the northwest, just south of Manchester, where I am, and I'm joined today by, of course, our hosts and our leaders of our webinar today, and my colleague Nina Alexander, who's our digital marketing manager, who's down in Milton Keynes. What's it like down there at the moment, Nina, in Milton Keynes? Sunny, windy, wet, gloomy?
Absolutely. It looks like the Caribbean. It is sunny outside. The weather is gorgeous. No, I'm just kidding. It's dark and gloomy.
I was going to
In
say
anticipation of snow.
I was going to say if it's sunny down there, send some warmth up north, please. It would be much appreciated. Wherever you're dialing in from today, guys, please feel free to say hello. Use the chat today throughout for interaction, questions as we go through today's content. And yeah, please use it throughout today. Tell us where you're dialing in from. I know some of us are UK based, others are much further afield. So yeah, please tell us where you're dialing in from. Before I bring in our two hosts today, Liz and Lizzie, just a little bit of usual housekeeping as we go through today. Of course, this is a recorded session for our CPD community. So if you don't want your screen to be shared, just flip your cameras off, go on mute. It is a 40-minute session today with content, with a Q&A at the end. And as I said, use the chat throughout to fire any questions in. If we have the opportunity to tackle your questions relevant to the slides and the content that Liz will be sharing, we'll see how we do for time. But don't worry, we'll have the Q&A mop-up session at the end to cover any questions. As I said, yeah, it's recorded today to be uploaded onto the YouTube channel. That's pretty much it in terms of housekeeping and introductions go. For those who haven't met me before, I'm Drew, and I'm one of the CPD advisors here. Some of you may have spoken to me before in some capacity, and if you are a member who is, if I'm your account manager, hello, good to see you all in this morning's session. So I think without further ado, let's get stuck into today's content. We have the wonderful Liz and Lizzie, Elizabeth, but I think Lizzie prefers Lizzie rather than Elizabeth. I think that's your Sunday name, Lizzie, is that right?
It is, yes.
And they are joining us from Charlotte Sweeney Associates. Today is all about diversity and inclusion. So without further ado, Lizzie, it's over to you.
Awesome. Thanks very much for the intro. I'm just going to share some slides that we have prepared. So just give me 1 minute to do that. You should all be seeing my screen right now. Nod if you can. I'm just going to also maximize my screen so that I'm able to see as many of you as possible. Really nice to see some of your faces and to see the diverse community that we have in this webinar today as well. So hello everyone, wherever you are. Just to do a little bit of an introduction from us. So Liz and myself and Lizzie, we are DE&I consultants at a DE&I consultancy called Charlotte Sweeney Associates. So it was founded by our founder, Charlotte Sweeney OBE, who has about 20 years of expert experience progressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, mostly in the financial services sector at the past, but also more globally and working with global organizations as well since starting Charlotte Sweeney Associates. We work with a lot of companies at different stages of their DE&I maturity journey. So whether they're at an early stage to a more mature stage, and we are a full service DE&I consultancy. So we work on things like strategies, supporting companies with delivering learning, also looking at audits at their people policies and practices. But we also look at the whole ecosystem. So, looking at their people, but also how do we make, their learning inclusive? How do we look at, how we communicate with the communities around us? How do we design our products so at each stage of that journey of the company ecosystem that we put diversity, equity, and inclusion at the heart of it? So that's a little bit about Charlotte Sweeney Associates. About me personally, so I'm from Hong Kong originally. I came over to the UK and currently based in London about 15 years ago, came here for university, actually have a legal background. So I was qualified as a finance lawyer for about 10 years. Then really took a pause to think about what I was going to further on a day-to-day basis that was going to give me that, fundamental satisfaction, hence my pivot to progressing DE&I now. And I joined Charlotte Sweeney Associates in 2020, so right in the heart of the pandemic. I also thought it would be helpful to share a little bit about what drives me to do the work that I do. I've got many instances that I could share about why I'm interested and passionate in pursuing DE&I, but I always think about the kind of personal conversations I have with my mum growing up. She's always harped on how important it is to have that independence, and for her, she found it difficult to, and had to choose between, having a career and looking after my sister and myself. And, her resilience has enabled me to be able to not have to choose between having a career and having a little baby girl myself. And I'd love to see, further work that's being done in society as well as, companies at large to make that a reality for people and have that gender equality. But of course, diversity and equity and inclusion is not just about, progressing gender. There's loads of other facets to it as well. And Lizzie and I will touch a little bit on that as well in our workshop today. But that's a little bit about me. So I'll hand over to Lizzie as well to do a bit of an introduction about herself before we start.
Thanks, Liz. So hi, everyone. Echo Liz's reflections on how great it is to see you all and how diverse the audience that we have today is. Always great to see. So I'm Lizzie. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an associate consultant at Charlotte Sweeney Associates and have been with the organisation just shy of 4 years now. Similarly to Liz, my passions around DE&I two really stem from my mum. So grew up in a bit of an unconventional household where my dad stayed at home and looked after me and my two sisters, and my mum was working full time, often traveling to do so. So have seen that real flip from a gender role perspective, and that's really helped frame my own expectations and ambitions for my life. And much to the disappointment of my partner means I can't iron and I'm not very well house kept. But that is a conversation for another day. Generally speaking, from a DE&I perspective, the element that really drives me and keeps me really engaged with this topic is really fundamentally about my desire and want to achieve equal access to opportunities for all. And that's irregardless of our race, ethnicity, gender identity, who we love, our sexual orientation, our age, disability, religion, social background. I firmly believe that we all have something to contribute to society, to the workplace, to each other, and that should be irrespective of our different characteristics, and really embrace those. So that's a little bit about me, and lovely to see you all, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you all in the chat as we go through the content.
Great, thank you, Lizzie. And as Lizzie mentioned, so today the session, the main aim really is to touch on how, as learning providers, do we ensure that we capture inclusion and diversity within our learning experience for all participants that are involved. Before we start, we always actually share this slide with all of our workshops, regardless of the workshop that we're running. We find it a really useful slide to use to agree the parameters on how we're all going to be working with each other to get to today, and also helps in creating that safety for participants to be able to share. And Lizzie, my colleague, will also touch a little bit on psychological safety in learning and how do we create that later in the session. So how we propose to work together to get today, we'd encourage you to speak up, use the chat, share your opinions. It's in these kind of parameters are we able to then get the most as well out of diverse perspectives in our learning workshops. We may not agree on everything, and it'll be important for us to respect our opinions of other people without judging. We encourage all our participants to listen. And by that, we mean kind of actively listening rather than, waiting to respond, but to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to share their opinion. And in order to keep an open mind, and that's the kind of framework that we're working in to ensure that we make the most out of our learning and to learn from different perspectives as well. And importantly, just to keep confidentiality. I know that this is going to be a session that is going to be held publicly, so that's going to impact a little bit about what we share with each other. But we thought as well that, sharing this slide will be a useful tool for you to consider and, see how you can adapt it to your learning as well, to create that safety within your learning environment. Just very quickly on the objectives of the session before we start, we'll touch a little bit about how facilitators can do more or less of to create an inclusive learning experience for participants. We'd like to encourage you to think of, the whole learning journey as an experience. So that's before a workshop, during the workshop, and also afterwards. How do you build psychological safety in learning sessions so that people are able to share, contribute, and even, challenge opinions? And then also develop an awareness of inclusive practices and how we can leverage this to create inclusion in our workshops. Before we start, I'll be interested to see as well if anyone had any comments to share in the chat regarding how we agreed to work together. Is there anything that anyone would add? Or it would be great actually if you can maybe do a thumbs up or say, okay, if you are happy for us to proceed on the basis of the parameters that we discussed before. Great, I can see a few thumbs up. Just giving everyone a few seconds to react as well. Just looking at the chat. Great. On that basis, we will start the content. So what we're going to be starting with first is practicing inclusion and how to incorporate that into your learning delivery. We've included on the slide here some inclusive actions that we would recommend and see it as tips, if you will, as to how you can create inclusion in your learning delivery. I'll go through a few of these in turn, and then on the next slide, I'll share a little question prompts as well to help bring some examples to life as to how you can incorporate these into your learning delivery. So one of the first things we talk about here is how do you proactively make it safe within your learning workshops for people to share? And I know a lot of you will be delivering different types of learning, and a lot of it won't touch on directly diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it's still important to allow learners to feel safe in order to contribute, to learn, and to challenge, for us to actively create that safe space for them to do so. So this question here is really about how do we ensure that the environment is a safe environment for participants to feel comfortable to share and contribute. And we'll touch a little bit later on some examples to do that. Another consideration is, pressing pause at relevant times. So for example, This could be whilst we're designing the content or during the delivery sessions themselves. So how do we press pause to ensure that inclusion is properly built into our content? Communicating inclusively is an important area. So how do we communicate to our learners throughout the learning experience? So this could be before the workshop. Do we ask and invite participants to share whether they have any accessibility requirements, for example? And you'll see at the beginning of this workshop prior to it, a few weeks ago, we'd also asked specifically whether anyone has any accessibility requirements that we need to take into consideration when designing and delivering this workshop as well. During the workshops, we could be thinking about how do we ensure that the language we use in the workshops are inclusive to a diverse audience. So we're also very cognizant that, for example, on today's workshop, we have a global audience. So we're going to be consciously thinking about the content that we're discussing and make sure that it's applicable for a global audience as well. Communicating inclusively also extends to things like learning styles, introversion and extroversion of the participants as well. Seeking diverse perspectives is important. So how do we ensure that we're bringing that all together in terms of different perspectives that we're gaining during the workshop? How do we invite people in to share their diverse perspectives? And that diverse perspective sometimes can cause, conflicting opinions within workshops. So it's facing into that, and how do we then kind of make sure that we're dealing with conflict in an inclusive way as well. Giving and receiving feedback is important. So how do we incorporate that process during the workshop, for example, afterwards, so that we can continue to improve the learning experience for participants? It's important as facilitators as well, in order to be inclusive, to develop self-awareness. So what are our current gaps in knowledge around diversity, equity, and inclusion? That could be currently stopping us from, delivering inclusion in our learning. Are there any aspects that we know less of that we should really educate ourselves? Because if they come up during our workshops, we want to be able to be fully comfortable in supporting that need. And then lastly, also diversity in design. So how do we incorporate diverse perspectives into the design of our learning content and delivery? Do we have, a group of people who have been involved in designing that content that have very similar characteristics, for example, and very similar experiences or worldviews? And how can we ensure that we bring some diverse perspectives into that, so that we're also catering to the diverse audience that we're delivering the training towards as well? So just pausing a little, we've also included a few questions here for us all to reflect on, that tie in specifically with the 7 inclusive actions that we mentioned before. So the first one we talked about was proactively making it safe. So when was the last time during a workshop that you delivered or learning that you delivered that you intervened or stepped in when someone wasn't behaving respectfully towards someone else in that training session? So how do we proactively make it a safe environment for everyone involved when someone is behaving in perhaps a disrespectful way? I'll share a little bit of an example of a workshop that I had delivered in the past. So someone felt very strongly about, the whole idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they thought, actually, we're moving towards too woke a society. I think for those who are in a global region and who may not be familiar with that term, that we are going towards too sensitive a view about people and progressing diversity and equity and inclusion. As a facilitator, I had to really put aside, what I personally felt very strongly about, I'm obviously an advocate for minority rights, and my support is always going to be with progressing minority rights and equality and equity for all. But at the same time, I needed to ensure that inclusion was for everyone within that workshop. So it was important for me not to kind of be, too overbearing with, my personal views. So what I did in that scenario was I reminded learners of the principles that we agreed to use to work together today. So looking back at, the principles that I shared with everyone at the beginning of the workshop, that we needed to have an open mind, we needed to respect each other, and also referred to the organization's values that the participants adhered to. So we were delivering to a company at that time. So I referred back to the company's values as well. So whilst everyone was entitled to their beliefs, we all agreed that we would respect each other, and not express, our opinions in a way that would have a negative impact on others around us. So that was an example of how we might actively make the workshop a safe place and step in when someone was acting disrespectfully towards others. The second point we talked about was whether we paused enough at various and relevant points in our content delivery or in the workshop itself. So for example, when delivering content to a global audience, do we make sure that the language we use is simple? And do we make sure that, for example, where English isn't a first language, we make pauses where relevant, and we speak at a pace that is easily understandable for others. It's also quite a common pitfall, I think, for people in the UK as well, to use metaphors or language that would have a space for misunderstanding as well. So it's pressing pause to reflect on our content and whether our delivery style is relevant. Communicating inclusively was what was the third element there. So when was the last time, for example, you reviewed your content to make sure that it's using gender inclusive language? So for example, I'm working with a company now in the automotive industry, and there's still instances in teams that are in a mixed room where people open the session to say, "Hello, gents, welcome." And the impact of this is that it's difficult for the women in the room who are already in the minority to feel, valued and visible. That is perhaps a dated, example for a lot of people in this room. But for example, Lizzie at the start of this workshop also shared her pronouns earlier on. The reason why we do this is because it makes it more comfortable for those where gender may not be binary to be able to share their pronouns as well. I know we're talking to a global audience here, so there may be different levels of exposure to this topic, and that's okay. We'd be very happy to answer any questions about it at a later stage as well. So this one, communicating inclusively, it doesn't really have to just be about gender inclusive language. It could be about the words we're using, whether it's easily understandable for people who don't speak English as a first language, for example. And it could also be from a neurodiversity perspective. So, if people are telling us that they might have an issue with, reading too much text in their materials, how do we then adapt, the workshop slides and the content to make sure that it's, simple layouts, simple text and not too overwhelming, and using a mixture of visuals as well as text, which I'm sure a lot of you are already doing in your content. Seeking diverse perspectives was the fourth one. So make sure everyone on the session is able to share, even the quieter members in the room. We deal with a lot of workshops where there's always some people who are more willing to share in that open, larger group, isn't there? While there are other people who seem really quiet and uncomfortable, but actually when we leverage kind of breakout rooms or smaller group activity, when you're doing it face to face, they then come to life. So it's kind of acknowledging that different way of sharing and different learning, and using different setups as well during the workshops to cater for that. Giving and receiving feedback was the fifth one. So I guess, when was the last time you asked the audience for feedback specifically relating to inclusion, or how accessible the content is for them? I know we'll probably use quite a lot of surveys at the end of workshops to get people's perspectives, but there are some useful questions we could use, for example, that's specifically targeted at inclusion and accessibility that we could also incorporate in that feedback survey in order to understand the perspectives from diverse participants. So accessibility could be physical, such as, how easy it was to access a physical venue, getting there to, from transport to actually entering the venue itself, whether there are accessible considerations within the venue itself. But it could also be less visible. So for example, what we talked about before from a neurodiversity perspective, to also, doing things like content slides that can be read through a screen reader for those who might be visibly impaired. So there's loads of different types of diversity we talk about there when we think about how do you get feedback for different audiences to make sure that it's inclusive and accessible for everyone. Developing self-awareness was the second to last point here. So we just wanted to signpost people to loads of DE&I topics and resources that are available publicly on the internet. So things like TED Talks and YouTube channels. Are there any specific areas of DE&I that you are most uncomfortable with, which you would like to learn more about? And lastly, diversity in design. So there's a lot of conversation about, a bias such as groupthink, so how, diverse and innovative is the design content that we're creating if it's put together by individuals with very similar backgrounds. So what are the knowledge gaps that you might not be covering in the content of your workshops itself because of the similarities of perspectives that are put into the design itself? Who can you ask within your network or within your organizations who may have a diverse perspective that they could share? It could also be useful to invite guest speakers to your workshop delivery as well. So other experts in other diverse areas that are relevant to your learning experience as well, which would be a very useful way to invite other people into that learning delivery itself. So I'm just going to pause a little bit, as I'm conscious that I've spoken quite a little bit on some of the inclusive actions we can take in order to make your learning facilitation more inclusive. I see some question coming in, and I'll take a look at that as well so that we can make sure that we cover some of those in the Q&A session. But next, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Lizzie, who's going to talk a little bit more about psychological safety and how do we create that in a learning environment.
And if you could just please go to the next slide. I'll be talking to you this part of the session around psychological safety. So if we think back to the key point around how we make it safe for others, this is a really key element of that. So creating a truly inclusive environment for learning takes a number of elements, one of those being psychological safety. So this is a really important element that defines if someone is comfortable to challenge and to speak up within either their team, their training cohort, the wider group, or even within their own organization. Psychological safety and inclusion go hand in hand. If people don't feel that they're comfortable being themselves within the training session, and feel able to speak up, or feel that they have had a chance to kind of fit into the wider cohort, whether that be through the breakout sessions, or the group of learners as a whole. They won't feel included and may disengage from the learning interventions. So it's really crucial that we keep everybody's access to this level of inclusion and safety in mind. So psychological safety is defined as being able to be yourself and speak up with ideas, questions, concerns, or be able to make mistakes, knowing that you will not be punished, humiliated, or nor will it have a negative impact on your career. It's really important that we get this right. The aim for psychologically safe working environments and learning environments is to increase intellectual friction and decrease social friction. So in increasing that intellectual friction, we'll have more people challenging, asking questions, speaking up, being open-minded and sharing their perspectives. But we will decrease that social friction because we will allow people to do that without fear of judgment. As you can see here, there are a number of different components that reinforce themselves. So for example, comfort admitting mistakes, learning from failure, everybody openly sharing their ideas, and this leading to better innovation and decision-making as a result of all of those things. If all of these elements are present, consider the impact it could have on your learning intervention, and consider the impact if they are not there. Liz, if you could please go to the next slide. So one of the great thinkers around psychological safety is a gentleman called Dr. Timothy Clark, and he pulled together these 4 key stages of psychological safety in his book titled The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. Each of these stages build on the next, and this is measured by levels of respect, so the general level of regard and esteem that we give each other, and permission, so the permission given to others to participate as members of the team, of a cohort, of their social group, and this allows them to influence us and participate in what we're doing. So I'll talk through each of these stages in a little bit more detail. So we have inclusion safety. So this satisfies the basic human need to connect and belong. So here people are respected for their individual humanity and have permission to interact as human beings. And for example, you have all signed up to this webinar. We have shared the meeting invite links with you, so therefore you are at the basic level included in this training. From a learner safety perspective, this really satisfies that basic human need to learn and to grow. So here people are respected for their innate need to learn and grow and have permission to engage in all aspects of the learning process. So for example, learners who are at learner safety during our sessions, they may not challenge us as facilitators if they go into a breakout room, for example, and they don't have clarity on what it is they're going to discuss. They might not raise their hand and say, I don't know what we're doing in here. They may instead try to work it out for themselves. They take that challenge, I guess, internally and figure out the instructions, or figure out based on the previous content what it is we're trying to get out of the session. And that's at that learner safety space. From a contributor safety perspective, this really is satisfying the basic human need to contribute and to make a difference. So here, people are respected for their ability to create value and have the permission to work with independence and use their own judgment. As facilitators, we'll find that people who are experiencing contributor safety will be more involved in interactive elements of our training. They'll pull from their previous experiences and be keen to add value for the rest of their cohort, and can be fantastic members to have in a session. From a challenger safety perspective, so this is at that top level of psychological safety. This is really where we're satisfying that basic human need to make things better. So here people are respected for their ability to innovate and have the permission to challenge the status quo in good faith. So that's really important, that it's in good faith and not disruptive. It's learners in challenger safety whose feedback will be highly valuable to us as we continue to shape our workshops and other learning interventions. People in challenger safety experience the highest form of psychological safety, and it's from those that we can learn the most to help to continue to develop our learning. It's important that we get as many people to that point as we can through our learning interventions, and we'll touch on how we can do that in a moment. As you can see in the model, before the inclusion level of psychological safety, there is the exclusion area. And this is where we don't want anybody to fall in an ideal scenario. So exclusion is where people are not respected and they don't feel they have the permission to be a member of the cohort or wider group. So for any of us that have felt excluded in the past, I have, it's not a nice feeling. This pain is actually triggered in triggers the same part of our brain that physical pain triggers. So it's a really real thing that is happening to us. And it's really important that we understand our responsibility as facilitators, taking our learning cohorts through our sessions, that we try to make sure that people are not falling into that bracket. And I want to be really clear, inclusion is the first stage of psychological safety. Innovation, active contribution, challenging freely, don't really kick in until we're at that fourth stage, challenger safety. And that's where we want to get people to. Our level of psychological safety is also dependent on our context, and this can change at any point. So for example, you may start a session and have a member or a couple of members of your cohort at that challenger safety and really contributing in an effective way as a result. However, at some point in that training session, somebody has said a comment or something has happened that has taken that person right down to feeling excluded. So it's something that is fluid and we need to be mindful of as we go through the training. So I'm going to pause here, and there's a couple of questions to reflect on the screen. And these are questions that we'd encourage you to continue to reflect on as you develop your learning and as you go through any facilitation in the future. And that's really, where do you think your learners are on this model? And constantly refer back to that question throughout the learning intervention. Where are they at the beginning? Where are they at the middle? Where are they when they go into smaller groups? And where are they at the end? And then what do you think you need to do to improve this? Or what do you think you could do to damage where they are at any given moment? So just have those two questions in the back of your mind through any future learning intervention and let this kind of help. I'll now pass back over to Liz, who will share some of those key actions that we can consider to really create psychological safety as facilitators.
Yeah, so we thought, thank you, Lizzie, that would be really helpful to share some of our tips as well to help create that psychological safety and move beyond just learner safety, but also thinking about contributor and challenger safety as well as more progressed levels of psychological safety. One of our really helpful tools is to make it personal and to use storytelling as well. And I know that's going to have to be adapted depending on, what content you're actually delivering in your workshops. But, Lizzie and I shared a bit, for example, earlier on about what drives us personally to do DE&I work at the start of the session. The aim of that really was, to start building that rapport and that psychologically safe environment for us to be able to share, and so that we can also lead by example as well. When delivering DE&I workshops, so I deliver quite a few workshops on understanding biases and how non-inclusive behavior can have an impact on others around you, specifically in the workplace. Sometimes I share a personal story of mine where I was working as a finance lawyer, for example, to illustrate the impact of non-inclusive comments and biased behavior. So I'll share the story with you now as well. So I was working in a very male-dominated environment as a finance lawyer. My whole team, though, strangely, was a very female-heavy team. So we had one male banking partner who was the boss of our team, and then the rest of the team was made up of all female lawyers. We worked really, really hard on this acquisition transaction. There were loads of late nights involved. lots of expertise demonstrated by everyone within that team. And at the end, we kind of got to a great successful result for our client. The deal had closed and everyone was in great spirits. But then the banking partner, who was the male partner in my team, then disclosed to us that the client had made a comment to him that describing that his team was basically Chris, my male partner, and his harem. And for those who are not familiar with that term, it's quite a dated term, I think that derived in the Middle East, that describes, women who were the wives and concubines of a polygamous man. So there was, in some respect, some kind of sexual connotations to that term as well. And what was the impact of that on the female members of the team? We sort of reflected on that a little bit afterwards and talked about how, regardless of the expertise, the legal expertise that we had demonstrated throughout that process and the hard work that we created, all that really meant with that comment was they flippantly negated all of that and really reduced us to our gender as women, and also the sexualized context around the nuance of that word as well. So that is a personal story of mine that I share sometimes in my workshops that really helps to demonstrate the negative impact that a non-inclusive behavior or comment can have, regardless of whether it's meant to be well-intentioned, lighthearted, or a joke. So incorporating some of those personal stories can really make it memorable for workshop participants to be able to illustrate your point, and for them to also take it away and share on an anonymized basis when they're making that point somewhere else as well. The second tip that we would share is about showing vulnerability. So I think the aim here is to make it comfortable for our participants to know that it's okay for them to make mistakes in order to learn. We find that sometimes participants feel uncomfortable with sharing a view because they are a bit unsure of the topic. They're not sure how it's going to be received by other people. They want to appear confident, but to help to create that psychological safety and make it comfortable for people to contribute, make mistakes, challenge each other, is to be able to show vulnerability yourself. So I've shared in the past where, I've made mistakes before about, DE&I topics. It's a topic that's constantly changing. It's not a static, topic or textbook. There are constantly changing societal expectations about, DE&I topics. And, I might have in the past accidentally mispronounced someone's name, for example, that I wasn't familiar with. And, in those situations, I apologize. I clarify what the correct way to say the name is, and be very open and transparent that I'd remember to do it correctly next time around. So there's that value in being able to show vulnerability as a as a facilitator as well, in order to make it comfortable for everyone around you to share. The last one, and these two are sort of relevant, but give space for different participants to share. So when someone has shared a particular viewpoint, how do we kind of introduce other people into that conversation as well to share the diverse perspectives? We find using open questions a really helpful technique to get different people to share their views. So phrases I personally like to use is, I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that. Or before I share my view as a facilitator, I'm curious to hear what others in the room think on this particular topic. I mentioned before as well that there was the workshop where I had, very differences of opinions on DE&I topics, and there was a bit of a conflicting situation. I think a very important tool there is always reminding participants of the values you agreed to on the outset, and the values that we're here today. So it's fine for everyone to have diverse perspectives and beliefs, but we're all signing up as part of the session to treat each other with respect. So that should also come into how we deliver our views as well. At this point, I'll be inviting Lizzie as well to share some of your useful tips that might that maybe add on to some of the ones that I touched on.
Yeah, no, thank you, Liz. And the piece here for me, it's a story actually that happened fairly recently in one of the sessions that I was delivering, and it really pivots around that give space for different participants to share. I am an extrovert and I love facilitating, and you can see I'm using my hands already. I'm very loud with it. So a piece of feedback that I got in the session was really around making sure that I gave space to people that were more introverted. My own style is led by my own excitement and passion. So it's something that I constantly have to really reassess in terms of how I show up and how I invite others to contribute, and really make sure that I'm taking a really significant step back and giving people the space to reflect. You know, that's so important for people, and it will allow people who are more introverted to really kind of ruminate on what it is they want to contribute and make sure they're comfortable contributing before they do. So very live example for me over the last few weeks, and I wanted to share that with you and be vulnerable about that feedback, as I think it's really useful and kind of lends itself to those different facets of diversity that aren't really around just the physical, and people's learning styles and diversity of thought and how we show up. So yeah, and what I do differently now is around really pressing pause and giving people space to think and reflect before pushing them for a contribution.
Thank you, Lizzie. I think we'll move on to the last slide here, which I will pass on to Lizzie as well, about certain things we can do less or more of in order to drive inclusion in our learning.
Thanks, Liz. So we're coming to the final few slides of our time together this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us. And we just wanted to share with you some key do less and do more actions to support you in creating a more inclusive learning environment for your cohorts. So the first point, instead of going at your own pace, regardless of the audience, similarly to the example I just shared with you, why not check in with your audience? You may have people in your cohort who aren't native speakers, for example, or who may be neurodivergent. So really consider if the tone and speed of what you're saying is appropriate for everybody on your session. Secondly, instead of half listening whilst you wait for your next turn to talk, you should really listen to understand. So practice silence, ask questions, be open-minded, and suspend judgment when others are sharing their contributions. Remember how quickly people can fall down the 4 stages of psychological safety. We can have a really big impact on that. So that listening piece and practicing those different elements is really crucial. Instead of preparing your learning materials without accessibility in mind and being reactive, is something Liz has covered quite extensively at the beginning of the session, take a more proactive approach to ensure learning materials are accessible. So communicate with your participants in advance of your session, check any specific accessibility requirements. You may have noticed the email that we sent ahead of our own webinar. Whilst we didn't have anybody come forward to suggest they had any accessibility requirements for this specific webinar, we have done in the past. So for example, we've previously created materials with patterned graphs where we were told there was someone who was colorblind attending the session to make sure they could experience and access the materials in the same way as the other learners. Instead of assuming any physical venue, instead of assuming any physical venue for training delivery is inclusive, where we have those face-to-face sessions, make sure you really ask questions of the venue providers and ensure that experience for learners will be inclusive. Familiarize yourself with accessible entrances, lifts, and any other supporting equipment that you may be asked about or need to kind of react to in the moment. Make sure you're really comfortable that you can be proactive and that you have selected a venue that is truly accessible. Finally, instead of ignoring or brushing over if a participant makes an offensive comment to somebody, or if a challenging conversation arises and seems to be escalating, make sure you facilitate inclusively to diffuse that immediate situation. So Liz shared her example from her facilitation where a perspective was shared that perhaps was a bit contentious. If you can, follow up with them after the session. And that's both from the individual that may have presented that kind of contentious opinion, or anybody else in the session that may have been impacted by that, if that's appropriate to do so. So these are kind of 5 key do less, do mores to get you really thinking about how you can start to embed inclusion and build that psychological safety into your different learning interventions. This is the starting point. Obviously, be creative. There's so many different ways we can include inclusive practices into our learning approaches. We'll move on to the final slide. So we just wanted to ask, reflecting on what you've heard today, what is the one thing that you would do differently to practice inclusion in your delivery? And if you feel comfortable including your one action or one piece you do differently in chat, we'd encourage you to do so. And it'd be great to hear your perspectives. And I think we'll be moving on to the Q&A shortly. So just wanted to thank you all for your time this today. It's been great to share these slides with you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Lizzie, for, wow, what a morning. Thank you for sharing everything there. Some really good thought-provoking messages there to help us consciously think about inclusion and diversity in the way we operate. And hopefully there's some really useful takeaways there. So I know we've got some questions in the chat here, but I, like many of us in this room and in this forum, like interaction. So let's use the hands. Let's come off mics and let's have some interactive questions for Liz and Lizzie. Has anybody got anything they'd like to go straight off the bat?
And just whilst everyone has a chance to reflect, I was going to pull out one of the questions that I saw in the chat as well that we haven't yet answered from Paul about how do we make sure that we don't single people out. So whilst we want to acknowledge that there's something we want to cater for to make them feel included, how do we make sure they're not singled out? I'd like to share an example. So for example, we run a leadership development course that was done virtually. And what we'd done was send an email out before the program was starting in order to ask people whether they have any accessibility requirements. And what we found really helpful was when those are shared with us, that we have a one-to-one conversation with them before the program's due to start, so that we really understand what their requirements are. So for example, we had a learning management system that we needed to make sure was accessible for them. And also that our learning content was catered to them. In particular, it was dyslexia that we were working around. But then because we did that preparatory stage and having those one-to-one conversations, it really then helped the program itself once it started and when everyone was in a group for it to be smooth for them and for them to then feel included so that everyone got the same learning experience that was built for all of them in mind. So I think it's making sure we do that, all that preparatory work to make sure it's a smooth process. I think another experience I would share is, we went to a DE&I conference earlier this year where I was actually still, nursing my baby. So I was on maternity leave and I had to go to the function knowing that, and I asked specifically as a learner whether I could have a room where I could be able to, pump and express, because I was still going through that process while I was on maternity leave. But throughout that process, it was a little bit non-inclusive for me and had the effect, which Paul mentioned there, about singling me out, because every time I had to access the room, I had to go find someone to unlock the room for me and then go in. So it made it a little bit of a difficult exercise and quite, almost embarrassing exercise for me to ask all this time. So if, you know, I guess the prep was done before to make sure it was an easy process for me, then I would then feel a lot more included and easy in that process. But yeah, as Andrew said earlier, I hope that answers a little bit of your question, Paul. But if anyone wants to unmute and ask their questions, Lizzie and I would be very happy to answer.
There's one here, Liz, from Simone. Can you point us in the right direction for top tips for designing accessible learning materials? What to consider? She wants to produce an easy document for facilitators to refer to when designing materials. Is there anything that you could perhaps advise or give a takeaway there, Liz?
I'm happy to jump in on this because I've done quite a bit of this with some of our online learning offerings. I will say that online, in terms of accessing easy resources, there aren't really that many, which is actually quite disappointing. One of my reflections as we were putting together our online learning is there's definitely more that we could do societally and as professionals to really think about and consider people's own experiences when they access our learning from a disability perspective and a neurodiversity perspective. There are the regulations, the WCAG regulations, that provide some helpful pointers to start your thinking, but I will say they are base level. So if you look to the WCAG, and let me just pop that I'll find a link to it and put it in the chat, but use that to kind of pivot from, and then, as I said earlier, be creative, ask questions, really, you know, try not to make assumptions about what people need. You know, go to people in those communities who represent people from disabilities and different elements of neurodiversity and ask them, you know, what do you find frustrating when you're accessing learning? How can we do this differently? But yeah, as a starting point, that's helpful. And then another point I'd just say is from a community perspective and a network perspective, there's, you know, however many of us that are on the call, 36 people, what a great network to tap into and see what other people are doing, and how we can kind of work together to find outcomes that mean that everybody can feel included when they access our content.
Yeah, I'd also add that I know that Scope and Accessibility for All are also charities that we use quite a lot in the UK to get tips from them about, you know, how to make, you know, journeys inclusive for learners. I think it's more not as specific to learners, but more, you know, individuals at large. But there are tips that we can pull from that as well. And am I correct as well, Lizzie, to say that, you know, with Microsoft tools, there's also various guides that are provided by Microsoft if you're creating virtual content to make sure that your documents are accessible for learners. So, you know, ways that you can build your slides and using Microsoft Word and PDF as well to make sure that, you know, for example, people can capture all that content or read it through a screen reader, for example.
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft have taken real strides in accessibility. So even from a language perspective, and I noticed Zoom as well this morning when I logged on, you can do the same. You can have closed captions that can be translated. On Microsoft Live, you can translate these slides that you're viewing so that you can read it in your own language or a language that you find easy to understand. So there's been a significant increase. I've also just popped a link to an organisation called Recite Me. So they have a quite extensive list of resources as well when we think about how we make sure our technologies are accessible, and that will include from a learning perspective. Yeah, Laura, thank you for also including makethingsaccessible.com. I'd encourage everybody to have a look at that too. I can also see another question from John. Can you give any tips to a facilitator that are neurodiverse with delivering course and workshops? Liz, I wonder if there's anything from your perspective that you'd be happy to share, linking back to that. I'm just thinking about the individuals on the learning program and their experiences.
Yeah, I think what has been helpful for me is actually, having that one-on-one conversation to ask this specific individual what would be a helpful way of design or content that would support them. I think there's a lot of resources on the internet for specific neurodiverse conditions. So for example, there's lots of websites about, dyslexia, or there's lots of websites about supporting individuals with ADHD, for example. But I think there's a danger or risk of, designing content based on kind of stereotypes or assumptions. So I think the safest way for me is always having that one-to-one conversation with someone prior to the sessions to understand, what we can do tailored that would actually support them.
I think from the perspective of us as facilitators, really using it to our advantage, and it goes back to an earlier conversation that we'd had around the content creation and making sure that there's a number of diverse professionals working together to pull that content together ahead of delivery. So from the perspective of a facilitator that is neurodiverse delivering the course and workshop, what a fantastic advantage, and how can you really leverage your own experiences to deliver training materials based on your strengths and how you view the world.
Thank you, Lizzie. I'm also conscious that we're now past 11 on the hour, and I don't want to keep everyone longer than I'm sure you've got very busy days ahead as well. Might pass on, I don't know if Andrew, you're still around.
I am indeed. I'm still here, guys. Yeah, we've got time for that last question that's just come in there. From We Chew. Do you have or know of any resources to design inclusive e-learning materials to complement face-to-face sessions?
Thanks, Wei. And that kind of goes back to my earlier point around those initial frustrations of seemingly a lack of resources. I'd have a look at the couple of links that we've got in the chat as a starter for 10. I'm more than, I work with the team to do our e-learning, so I'm more than happy to have a conversation offline to see, if I can share any pearls of wisdom that has helped me in pulling together our own e-learning content with that in mind. And
a little heart emoji at the top there, which is always nice. Thanks, Wei. Yes, a lot of feedback coming in on the chat there. Thank you. A lot of useful takeaways, some thought-provoking insights to go and revisit, or perhaps go and do differently as we leave today's session. So a big thank you to everybody who's joined and dialed in today on Monday morning. And ladies, thank you, Liz. Thank you, Lizzie. For your content and for your contribution today. Really insightful and useful stuff for all of us to take away in our businesses. So thank you, everybody. All that leaves me to say is have a wonderful Christmas and enjoy the festive period, the run into Christmas. I know I'll be catching up with some of you in the next few weeks as we kind of wind down from account management reviews and things like that. But I wish you all the very best for over the Christmas period, and for every success for 2024 going forwards. Have a great Monday. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you.
Take care. Bye-bye.